Hello everyone, this is the second class of week 3. We're going to be working more with curves and surfaces, so Beziers and NURBS. And today I'll show you a few more options we can use with those just in like a general sense. And then we'll also be making a decorative stick and a backdrop for our still life. So let us get started. First, I'm just going to make this full screen. There we go. Bring in some curves. So I'm going to bring in a Bezier and then a NURB. So Shift A, Bezier, Shift A, NURB. And then I'm going to be working with a new menu we haven't touched on before. All objects are going to have this menu, but what is included in it will differ depending on what you have selected. So the menu I'm referring to is in that bottom right section, but it's called the Object Data Properties, and it's that green icon. So you can see if I have like a poly mesh selected, we still have that menu show up, but what's inside that menu is going to be different from what's in our curve menu. So let's select one of our curves. So I have my Bezier selected. And I have a Bezier and a NURB pulled in because there is only one minor difference between their menus. Everything else is going to work the same between them except for like one little small area, which I'll point out at the end. But once we have this, let me like reset it. Okay. There are 3 areas in this I want to point to that you guys might utilize in the future. So one thing that I probably should have touched on last class is we have this handy 2D, 3D toggle. So last class, when we were like placing our points by extrusion, we were in an orthographic view so that our points were constrained to a 2D plane. Because oftentimes when you're working with a curve, you probably want it 2D. That's what we did with our base. But you do have the potential to place it 3D. And if you're placing it in perspective view and it's placing everything down 3D, you can hit the 2D button. And you can see all of my points that I just placed are now just along that flat YX plane. I can place some more points in, and they're all just in that 2D plane. So that is an option if you would prefer working in perspective than an orthographic view. Let's jump down to the next section of interest, which is geometry. So in this menu, let me open it. I'm like reducing my handles. I don't like that they're all so big. So when you open up geometry, you'll probably notice 2 familiar words. One is extrude. I mean, hopefully you recognize a lot of words, but ones of note are extrude and bevel. So let's play around with what these do, because we've worked with them before, but they're going to work a little bit differently with our curves. So extrude, in the Object Data Properties menu, if you slide that value higher than 0, you can see a surface was created from my squiggle, my spline that I just drew out. So it's creating a surface both like vertically or in both vertical directions, up and down, with that 2D line. Let's put that back at 0. And let's see what increasing our bevel does. So bevel, you'll increase it with the depth. And if we slide that up, you can see we have a new surface, like this tubular surface. This is how I foresee some of you might make like wiring, piping. If you have any cables in some of your future scenes, this is a pretty simple way to do that. Basically what's happening is just like the default bevel is a circle is following your squiggle line. So a circle was attached to this endpoint and is traveling down the squiggle, down the spline all the way. So that's why we have this surface. With the default one, you do have a few more options you could play around with. If you wanted to change the smoothness, roughness of that surface, you do have two areas to play around with resolution. You can see the resolution beneath bevel is to change how smooth that circle is. And you also have a resolution back up near that 2D, 3D button. And let's decrease that. You can see this one determines how smooth that tube is that you created. So if you want it to be like a more like mechanical tubing, you might decrease that. Okay, so really quick, while we still have our bevel on, let's increase our extrusion so you can see how they interact. So we still have like that circle that went through, but now it's being extruded up and down. So we kind of made this like thick foam cushiony surface. And then you might notice we do have dropper bottles. And we'll play with those in just a second after I touch on like the last very quick options that are a possibility. So the last menu of interest in our object data properties menu is the active spline area. And this is the one area that differs between the NURB and the Bezier. So if you click between either of them, you can see there's a few different options. And the ones that you'll probably use the most for both, there's cyclic U under both of them. If you check that, you can see it's automatically connecting my end and start point of that curve. So if you wanted a more like a circular continuous object like a hair tie, a rubber band, you could check mark cyclic U. Our NURB also has cyclic U, so you can make that continuous curve. Another one of note that I usually have check marked is endpoint U. So generally, when you're working, I'll put that in 2D, when you're working with your NURB, you have this end and start point that are kind of just guides of where your curve is headed next, but it's not determining where in the world it's starting and finishing. If you do want them to actually determine the positioning of the start and end point of that curve, you can check mark end point U. So you can see now the black line is actually attached to those points. So I have a lot easier time like understanding what the curve is doing when I have endpoint U selected. But again, that's more just preference. So now that we speed ran through those settings, you can click around, see what other options do. Most of the stuff in here is going to more come up on personal project basis, but I just wanted to point out things that can help your workflow and then areas I think will be of most interest in the future. So let's really quick go into a little bit more depth with extrude and bevel before we get started on making a couple of objects. So I'm just going to work with the NURB because I kept it as a simple curve. So we have a dropper bottle under our extrude option and then our bevel option. And these are going to give you a little bit more customization of how the extrude and how the bevel is happening. And I'm just going to bring in another NURB. So here's my demonstration NURB. Oh, it is in 2D. Okay. It's like, what? Okay. And I'm going to attach this new NURB as the taper object. So here's my basic extrusion Default one is just kind of like a rectangle that's created because it's just equally extruding that line throughout that curve. But if I assign a taper object, you can see now my new NURBS curve is attached. We didn't really see much of a change, but that's just because we haven't really altered this that much. So if you go in and start altering, and I'm going to attach that endpoint U because of who I am as a person. But now you might notice, as I'm pulling these points around in the curve that I had attached, it's influencing the form, the silhouette of that extrusion. So you can use a curve to define how that extrusion is happening. You can even like add some more values here to add a little bit more customization. So right now you can see I'm like creating kind of a leaf shape. And actually let me show you like, so this is the shape I'm using to influence this. So you can kind of see that it's like tracing it onto that rectangle and cutting it out, both going upward and going downward. And now I'm gonna just cancel that and let's use it as our bevel object instead. So I'll get rid of my extrude just so you guys can see like what the actual change is affecting. So with my bevel object eyedropper, let's click on that extra NURB and you can see a new surface was created. Sorry, there's like knocking happening outside right now. What is it? And you might notice, again, this is affecting me moving around the points of the curve I assigned to it, is affecting the form of that surface that was created. So this one, again, let's look at the curve that is being used. It has this high point and then it goes down. If I go to one of the ends of my curve, you can see it has that same profile. So it's basically taking this like piece of paper squiggle line drawing, attaching it to the start point and then sliding it down that line. So it's creating a surface from that sliding down the whole way. So if for any reason you needed to use this besides just that default circle going down, so we're actually going to use it. We're going to make our own like irregular circle for a more organic looking form. I just keep using a star example. If you need like a long star shaped thing, you could draw out a star, attach it onto that and slide it down. And actually you can use other type of objects. So right now I'm using like curve objects still, but I can, if I wanted to work with a mesh for my cord, I can pull in a cylinder and have that follow down so that I have actual vertices and faces to work with. If I was doing an animation of the scene and I wanted my camera to move through the scene, I might attach a camera to, I'm like pointing with my fingers. I might attach a camera to the spline and it'll move down that spline as it's recording for like a more dynamic animation. So again, this is more going to come up of like potential of use in the future. But now you can kind of see like how NURBS are used for like general curvy surfaces, for like landscapes and like car design is their like main use. So now that we just like covered general options, we're going to go in and make a decorative stick. A decorative stick for our vase that we made last class. And I went ahead, I deleted my reference image, and I just like piled up all of my objects in a little like quick composition for a still life. If you have any hidden objects, you can hit Alt H to unhide them. And I just realized I never turned on my key tracker. But again, you can hit Alt H to unhide anything, and then I just made everything look like it's resting on that red axis, so everything's on the X axis as like where the table is. And first thing we're going to do is make a decorative stick. So we're going to use a Bezier. Again, you can do a NURB if you prefer. I'm going to do a Bezier in this instance just because I'm a little bit sloppier with it and I can't get as smooth of curves. So I think that will help with making a more organic looking stick. Scale it down a little bit. And then we can go in and start editing it. So last class, we are working with just like grabbing and extruding, and that's what we're just going to do in the beginning of this. But now I can hit the 2D key so I can stay in my perspective view. Again, you could go into top view, and I'm going to automatically hit all the wrong hotkeys. So I'm going to go in, start extruding it to get a few points in. And I'm just making just like a straight line. So it's just a stick, nothing too fancy. Maybe I want it to like be curving, like bending over a little bit so I can, I don't know, I could do that, I guess. Why not? Why not? Oh my god, I just hid my point. Why do I keep doing this? Keep hitting H instead of G. There, now it's bending. Beautiful stick. Again, if you want a circular stick, cyclic U, perfect. In this case, so now I want to give it some thickness going down it, so I'm going to add a bevel object. And rather than doing that default bevel, I'm going to add a circle that I can modify, so I'm going to do Shift A, and under curve, you can see there's a circle beneath both Bezier and that NURB option. So let's add that Bezier circle, and make sure I'm labeling things as I go. Why do I have like a mystery Bezier circle in my scene? Huh. Go away. Okay. So here's that circle I just made. Let's scale it down because that's going to be a thick stick. That's still going to be thick, but let's assign it. So this is similar to Booleans where you want to make sure you have the proper like parent object selected, the one that you're keeping, and then use the dropper and then select your second object. So first object is the stick, second object is my circle I just made. So I attached that circle. It looks very similar to what happened when I just increased the depth of my bevel. But this time, I have a little bit more control over the shape of the circle that's traveling down the spline. And this can just be in a 2D space because it's just paying attention to that like line drawing on a piece of paper. And I can like smush this around. So I'm just playing with the form of the circle, and you can see it's being reflected in the shape of my stick now. And you can see like this circle that was created is just made up of the Bezier handles. They just like cheated and did a cyclic U circle for you, so you didn't have to make one yourself. So I made just a little irregular circle that's now traveling down my spline. and we just want to do a few more alterations. One is, this is like a tunnel, so we want to close this off, and we actually have a handy dandy button. So in the bottom right, if my face, I never checked where my face was. Okay, my face is fine. So in the bottom right, again, in your object data properties menu, you can click fill caps and it will fill those up. And now I kind of want to alter like the width, like the thickness of my stick as it's traveling down, because I want like a thicker end and then a skinnier end. And like rescaling this scales it uniformly. So I need a little bit more of like customizable control, more specific control. And technically, I could put in an extrude taper object. So if you want like a very specific customization of your stick, you can draw out with a curve like where you want it thicker, push it in to make it thinner, and that would work perfectly well. Assign it to that taper object for the extrusion, and it will affect the width of that circle going down. So that's like the harder mode. You'll have like unlimited amount of control over that. But because this is a simple stick, we don't need to go that hard. We're going to use the easier method. And with that, we're going to be in edit mode. We're going to hit hotkey. We've used this like 3 times now, N. So hit N. It'll bring up that little menu in the top right of your viewport. And if I have one of my points selected, you can see it's giving me world info about the point. I can move it around in here, but I also have a radius option. So you might notice if you increase that or decrease it, the size of the circle at that point is changing. So I can go in to my various points, alter the radius. If I need more points to customize, I can still go in, either do more extrusions, or I can select 2 points, right click, hit subdivide, and that'll give me another point that I can change the radius of. So again, that was just hitting N and then working with the radius of each of those points. Look at that beautiful stick. It's beautiful. And now say I want to customize this even more, give it branches coming off. This might be a scenario where I convert it to a mesh and continue working with my tools that way. So I'm going to show you that really quick before we move on to our next object. So I would recommend before converting it that you make a duplicate of it, just because you won't be able to go back and play with the curve at all after you do convert it. So if you want to duplicate it, hit Shift D. You can see my outliner, it made a second stick option. And you can see when hovering, I can either place it somewhere, or if I hit right click, it's just going to keep it overlapping with my OG stick. And I'm just going to rename it just like stick copy. And then I'm going to hide it right away. So just hit H, and now I just have one stick again. And we're going to convert it. We don't have to worry because we have an old version duplicated. So to convert it, we're going up to our menu in that top left hand corner of the viewport, and we're going to the object category. So select object, go down to convert to, and here you have an option to make a mesh from a curve. So that's what we're doing. You can see there's other options that you might use in the future. Most often I'm converting meshes from curves. Yeah, I'm making meshes from curves. I'm like, did I say that? And now, if you hit tab, you can see you have a whole lot of faces and vertices. So this is probably actually like way too much information on such a simple stick. But for now, we'll leave that. And I just want to show you guys that then you can go in, work with your poly modeling tools and do any alterations that you might want now. So say I want like a branch coming off here. I can extrude some faces. So zoom in really quick. You can see I have faces. If I want a smaller section of faces, I can go in and do a loop cut. Otherwise, I can select. I'm not in face mode anymore. Select a grouping of them. And then I can extrude them. So either hit E, or you can click on that button, and I can pull them out. So you can see we can make a like little branch. I can even give it like a 2-point slant, scale it down. So we have a little branch. So that might be like a scenario of why you would convert a curve into a mesh. So that's all we're going to do with that. Now we're going to make a backdrop. And the backdrop, so I'm going to like put this in my pot. I think this is a little too big still. The backdrop, we're actually going to be using surface. So the first class, I think I mentioned that there are curves and then there are surfaces. And it's a little confusing because they have kind of the same options between them. How's that looking? We have a little stick. So once you have this in here, you can easily go in, duplicate this, make a few alterations either with just your proportional selection tool and just like push the branch around, or you can go back to your copy version of your stick when it was a curve, and you can change the curve that way to add a little bit of variation of your decorative sticks. But now we're going to make a backdrop, so one of those like fabric flowing backdrops. So Shift A, what I was just mentioning is we're going to be doing a surface. So we've been doing curves, which have a Bezier and then a NURB. And then below curve we have surface, which has NURBs. And Blender treats these two NURBs differently. It's treating the curve NURB as like a 2D object. So we used it as a 2D object for that vase. You're usually kind of using it as a guide for more stuff to happen, but the surface is treating that NURB as a 3D object. So it's going to work a little bit differently. If these steps don't work properly for you, it's most likely just because you put in that curve NURBS curve instead of the surface NURBS curve. And I feel like there should be some kind of configuration where you can like convert them. I haven't found it yet, but I find it's hard to believe that there wouldn't be a way to like switch between them. But for now, just make sure you're going under surface and then hitting NURBS curve. So it's going to look the exact same. You might notice there aren't as many options under your Object Data Properties tab. Backdrop. But we have our NURB. And right away, because I prefer working with that endpoint U on, I can click that. And you might notice there's also an option for V. So this will become relevant in one of the final steps for this, so you'll see what that means. But for now, we just need our endpoint U. If we prefer working that way, where we have our line attaching to those endpoints rather than being guided by the endpoints, influenced by the endpoints. So for this, so I'm like talking so fast to try to make these as short as possible. I'm like starting to lose my breath. So I want to make like an outline of my drape in this plane. So my ZX, right now it's on YX. So first I'm going to rotate this, and I can either rotate it around the X 90 degrees or under, like over or under -90. So I can type -90, hit enter, and now it's like a little happy smile face. And then if I go, so this one you can see it doesn't have that like 2D, 3D restriction. So if you do want your points restricted, make sure you go into an orthographic view. But now I'm just going to go in, start positioning my points to be like a back wall, then travel along that red line like it's hitting the surface of the table before draping down. If you want more detail in your fabric, add more points than what I'm putting. But I'm just going to put enough to get like that general curve. So again, I'm just hitting extrude, so E. There is that key on the left side, but I'm just hitting E for that. Nice and quick. Okay, and then I'm just going to position these to try to get that black line looking like it's laying, supporting my objects. So I might actually need to add a little bit more control in there with some more points. There's like so much knocking happening beneath me. What is going on? Okay, so we have this squiggle, the most stylish squiggle. And now here's the step where it will differentiate between if you made it with the curve, NURBS curve, or the surface NURBS curve. Do you hear that? What is going on? So we're going to duplicate this, but when we duplicate it, we want to make sure we're in edit mode. So make sure edit mode is enabled. You can see all of those control points, and then we want to select all of them. So just hit A, and we're going to duplicate this curve. So Shift D. We can check to make sure we're doing this correctly because no object is being added in our outliner, even though we see a separate line on our screen, so it's still just one object. When we go into object mode, you can see just like two little lines are that same object now. So I'm going to do that a few times. Restrain it to Y just to move it down a little bit. Shift D, Y, left click. Shift D, Y, left click. So now I have a row of matching squiggles. And this is the actual point where you'll see if you did use the wrong NURB. So now I want to hit A again to have every single one of those control points selected across all of those squiggles. So hit A, and then we're going to hit F for fill. So I've said F for fill, F for face before. In this case, it's not creating faces. In this case, it's not creating faces, just because this is a surface. So a surface is different from a mesh. Pause. Surfaces are different from mesh because of magic. So this is just a surface. You don't have vertices, edges, or faces to work with. We just have our curve to work with. But when you hit F, you're going to see it made like a nice little like ribbon backdrop. And technically you could create this exact form with your NURB by drawing that squiggle and then just doing that default extrusion to make it like branch out to the left and right. But the reason why we use the surface one is now I can go in and change like the more, let me turn on soft selection. Oh, and increase my proportion. So again, O is soft selection, and then scrolling that wheel will change the influence. But now I can go in, change how some of those control points are laying, and make it a more like dynamic, organic backdrop. So if you want a lot more control over that fabric, you can have these splices closer together, add more control points, just to add a little bit of variety. And you might notice that it's going from the top to the bottom, but it's not reaching from that very left spline. I'm just gonna do a random S word for whatever these are. It's not reaching from the left to the right fully, and that's where that other endpoint UV mechanic comes from. So it's kind of similar to like the X and Y component. U and V is like an axis on an object, and this is going to become more relevant in the coming weeks when we're doing materials, but there's like a U direction and then a V direction on an object. So we just need to activate both of those endpoints if you want that like connected to the all of those points as a framing device. So you could go back in here now, change it around how it's laying. I would probably want to squish this in to add a little bit more like refined detail rather than just like vague slope. But you can see we can add some alterations just because we have all of these control points we can use. And it's good for just making like general landscape. So that's all we're going over today. Just more potential of using the curves. So if you're more comfortable working with these, go ahead and keep modeling with them. But again, if you were more comfortable working with polys, that is the actual like dominant way of modeling. But there will come a time when like using some of those curves will be easier. So like if you're making wiring, any kind of cylindrical object. So that's all for this class. Next classes will be moving on from modeling. So finish up your few more objects. Finish up your cupcake, finish up your spoon, your vase. Try to make 2 more objects for next class. It can be either a curve or a polygon, but I'll see you guys next time.